So you have your mind and then you have your body. But really, we can't do without either one in terms of balance in order for them to feel like there can be true expression of health.
Welcome to the Dutch Podcast, where we dive deep into the science of hormones, wellness, and personalized healthcare. I'm Dr. Jaclyn Smeaton, Chief Medical Officer at Dutch. Join us every Tuesday as we bring you expert insights, cutting-edge research, and practical tips to help you take control of your health from the inside out. Whether you're a healthcare professional or simply looking to optimize your own well-being, we've got you covered. The contents of this podcast are for educational and informational purposes only. This information is not to be interpreted or mistaken for medical advice. Consult your healthcare provider for medical advice, diagnosis, and treatment. Hi there. Welcome to this week's episode of the Dutch Podcast. Now, this week, I think we're all talking about how just fabulous this episode was, and really maybe a little bit different than some of the episodes we talk about here. And the reason for that is that I think we covered one of the most challenging aspects of hormonal support for women, and that is stress and trauma. And the fact that when a woman has stress and trauma, or she's not even, maybe not, she wouldn't describe it as stress and trauma, but she's not living the life that she really wants to be living, that can impact the hormones, the reproductive hormones. Our guest today has spent really a ton of time in her practice honing in how she talks about this with patients. And there were so many truth bombs dropped, and there were so many light bulb moments for me, just in the fact that there are ways that we can really effectively help women with this. We are going to talk about deep science of stress and hormones, and talk about the work that you can do to help women kind of rise out of that patterns of stress, rise out of the stories they're telling themselves about who they are, and really make a huge impact in how their hormones are balanced. My guest today is Dr. Sonya Jensen. She's a naturopathic physician, speaker, and author whose work sits at that intersection of hormonal health, emotional healing, and ancestral wisdom. Rooted in a background of cell biology and naturopathic medicine, she's built a practice around trauma-informed care, herbal medicine, nutrition, hormones, and nervous system support, really focused around addressing the deeper patterns that drive hormonal imbalance in women. She's the founder of the Her Method and Her Community, both created to help women decode what their bodies are communicating through stress, emotion, and generational experience. Her new book, Heal Your Hormones, Reclaim Yourself, brings that same whole body framework to women who are ready to move beyond symptom management into lasting recovery. This was truly one of my absolute favorite conversations. I want to go ahead and introduce our guest. So I want to start by, I always love to orient myself and our guest to hearing a little bit more about your backstory. And tell me a little bit about why you chose naturopathic medicine as a field, and more specifically, women's hormonal health.
Yeah, that's actually a really long story, so I'll try to make it super concise. I've always been interested in the human body and supporting others. I just didn't know what that was going to look like. My career went from criminology and wanting to become a police officer to all of a sudden taking that one science class in college and being like, oh, wait, no, this is the direction I want to go in. And my background and degree is actually in cell and molecular biology. And after I had graduated university, I still had no clue as to what I wanted to do or how I wanted to express this like desire to help. And I started doing massage therapy, and it was actually by accident that I called a naturopathic school. And I had called the wrong number and started learning more about it. And instantly I was like, yes, this is the thing that I've been waiting for. And throughout that journey, the 4 years of training postgraduate, I went through a lot of my own healing. I ended up getting a divorce during those years, started to uncover a lot of the story and layers that I had been carrying for many, many years around stress and trauma and all of that, and was working with women in those last 2 years of schooling and seeing patterns show up in women's lives when they weren't doing the work earlier on. They were suffering in their 40s and 50s. And postgraduate, took time off for myself, took 2 years away, lived in Southeast Asia to figure out who I am, what I wanted for life, and what kind of doctor I wanted to be. And, fast forward with my husband now, we opened our clinic and have 2 boys. And during that process of pregnancy and working with families and women, I just started to really see the disconnect in our medical system and how women for so long are just not heard or not validated in how they feel. And because of my own healing that needed to happen, it kind of took me down this trajectory of women's health. So that was a very like shortened version of a very
It was
long story.
perfect. And I mean, I think it was just one, I think our stories are like so resonant. We should definitely chat offline. It's so
Yeah.
interesting just on our backgrounds and interests. But I think the thing that stands out to me the most is just that experience of being a clinician on the other side of women who are in their 40s and 50s. And that same thing happened to me. I graduated med school and let's say I was 26 years old. So I was there talking with women a couple of decades older, predominantly coming in to see me. And, you could really see the way that family stress, family trauma shows up physically and emotionally across a spectrum of hundreds of patients. And it is a really eye-opening experience.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I could see myself in them. And I knew if I didn't make the changes I needed to, and that big change for me at that time was getting a divorce, that I would be that woman in that seat with cancer or with some sort of autoimmune disorder and trying to make those changes once maybe my kids were grown up and it was okay to leave. It was so eye-opening for me. And like you said, it's hundreds. It's not just the one woman. It was a very common theme and that I still see up until today.
Well, this is going to be the topic that we really get to dive into. You brought us right there. And I love these kinds of conversations where rather than be on the surface, we're really talking about these things that I think a lot of us face but have trouble putting words to, truthfully, and certainly putting action to. So for those of people that are listening today, I hope you are willing to go there with us and have those conversations and hopefully come out of it with some new insights. So I want to just start because I think this comes into play a lot with hormonal health, and maybe this is like the first place that stress and trauma and things like this show up. I mean, we know that fertility, for example, is like the canary in the coal mine when it comes to a sensitive system. That's one of the first, probably digestion and hormonal systems are the first ones to be disrupted when someone's experiencing stress, right? But and research is really bringing us there. It's increasingly revealing that this emotional experience and stress history leave a measurable biological footprint. But it still seems like hormone imbalance is in the emotional aspect or contributing factor is like oftentimes left out of the clinical picture. Can you talk a little bit about that? Is that your experience as well?
Yeah, I often have women sitting in front of me and saying that, I feel like I'm losing it. I'm irrational, I'm irritable, I'm frustrated, I have so much rage, and there's so much going on, and I don't know what is happening in my body, and this isn't who I am. And if I bring this up to my medical doctor, they just say, oh, it's just a little bit of stress, or you're just aging, or here's an anti-anxiety medication or something that's going to mask how I'm feeling rather than trying to figure out the why behind how she's feeling. And so there's such a disconnect between those hormonal changes that happen, especially in perimenopause. I was starting to see this pattern of so many women going on antidepressants at that time. And so when you start to like peel back the why behind that, you start to see there's major hormonal changes that are happening. So her brain is shifting, her reactions are shifting, her resilience has changed. And so if we can like tune into that and support those hormones, because they're just acting as messengers. I mean, they're not necessarily the problem, it's the environment that needs to change. And so I often see that in my clinical practice where those two worlds are so compartmentalized. So you have your mind and then you have your body. But really, we can't do without either one in terms of balance. We have to work on both in order for them to feel like there can be true expression of health.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Just as a personal disclosure, I lost my husband in January unexpectedly, and
I'm
it's
sorry.
really interesting for me as a clinician to experience grief to that level because the way that it tears your physiology apart is so in your face. It's like you just can't ignore it. And I've always really believed in the that tie-in with emotionality, but I think people feel like it's a soft connect, and it's not. It's a
Mm-hmm.
hardwired hard connect. And I think if you experience something major, when you look at like for me it was sleep disruption predominantly, but my menstrual cycle changed, I started getting menstrual migraines, like all this stuff happened right there in the midst of this extremely stressful situation. And it really brings to light the fact that, like, it's really very profound physiology that changes when you have these kinds of stressors in your life. And when you think about this prolonged stress, or when it happens in childhood, when it kind of sets patterns for your neurobiology, it's incredibly impactful. And I'm just so excited to be talking about this today, because it's something that this experience this year it made me increasingly passionate about making sure that people take care of this.
Yeah, I'm so sorry for your loss, and thank you for sharing that with me. And there was a quote that I actually saw in front of a church that has always sat with me around grief, and that grief is just love that has no place to go. So when we're experiencing that grief in that moment, and we're actually experiencing so much love in that moment too, because of our relations and experiences with that loss. So thank you so much for
Yeah,
sharing
thank you. And
that.
I've seen that quote. I think it's so
Yeah,
incredibly beautiful.
yeah,
But I think that, I always think about, and I would say to my patients, like, your symptoms sometimes start in a whisper. And then
yes.
if you don't listen, they get a little bit louder and a little bit
Hmm.
louder. I mean, you mentioned cancer as an example.
Hmm.
That's screaming, right? But,
Hmm.
you talk about the stories that your body is telling. Can you talk a little bit more about what you mean by that when you say it, and how you see it show up in your patients?
Yeah, I feel like this is probably the key to healing, when we can understand our own story, and that story can be reflected through how we were modeled how to be as women. So where we modeled people pleasing, overworking, overachieving, performing, or were there things, patterns passed down through the generations, through family, through culture, or even society, that start to frame how we're operating in our world, and especially our beliefs about ourselves. So the stories we carry are really the beliefs about how we're supposed to be in order to receive love, in order to belong, in order to navigate this world. And so that story, I feel like it's carried in our cells with our hormones. So as we're growing, even in the womb, like studies are now showing how much of an impact our mom's stress levels will have on our own resilience as we're navigating life. And so when we start to see that correlation, and as we're growing, and age 3 to 5 and 5 to 7, DHEA is starting to rise, and it's often in opposition of cortisol. And so, because they have such an inverse relationship, if your childhood had levels of stress, or stresses that you weren't even aware of consciously, your physiology is going to respond for you. Your brain will respond for you to protect you. And so, if it has to increase your cortisol, it has to downregulate these other hormones that are supposed to provide information to your body to produce your estrogen, your progesterone, those sex hormones we need in order to thrive and grow. And so these stories we carry, I find we operate so much throughout life without actually thinking about who the narrator is in our mind, like who's calling the shots. And if we actually sit with that, we start to realize, okay, wow, it's been my family, or it's been culture, and now maybe it's social media, and I'm not even making choices from like my own willingness and wisdom and intuition, but instead from outsourcing my power to the world outside of me.
I love the way that you said that. And I think that's something that is so impactful, because I think when we weigh what our conscious story is about ourselves, and then you weigh the kind of subconscious stories that come from what others say about you, it's so interesting how people tend to apply more value to what they're hearing about who they are versus what they know about who they are. And I've thought a lot about that, especially as a parent, because I want my children to have a different experience of learning. But one of the things they learned in one of their classes, which I thought was so profound, was like, just because someone says something doesn't mean it's true,
Mm.
right? And it
Hmm.
made them like put their hand on their hip to make this little trash can, like this, and they had to like physically take that thing and throw it in the trash can.
Oh, I love
And it,
that.
and it made me laugh. I mean, that's a great thing for small children, but I
Yeah.
was like, wow, adults should really be doing that too. Women should really be doing that too, because
Hmm.
we hear so many things that, we should give ourselves permission to say that's actually not true, and throw it away, and then never think about it again, and instead focus on the way we feel about ourselves and about our own story.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I love that reframe. And, there's that saying, how you speak to a child becomes their inner voice. And so we as women that are maybe perimenopause or menopause, in these like years where we're trying to navigate ourselves and our body and our life and our changes, we start to see that it's actually that little girl that needs the support that she never received. And there's a lot of unlearning that we have to do as adults around like who I'm supposed to be and which identities I've packed on, which roles I'm playing. And often it has to do with being loved or belonging or feeling safe in our environment. So when we start to kind of unpack that, we start to realize like, yeah, I haven't been playing out my own story, but maybe now I get to choose that story and I get to make choices that allow me to navigate this next part of my life from my own command and not from the environment.
So, how common is it that women are going in for help hormonally and they're being treated, but this emotional history has never been addressed or maybe never even asked about? How common of a problem is this?
Oh, I would say upwards of 90%, if not more. Because when, you know, a woman comes to me, she'll initially be like, okay, I can't sleep, I can't lose weight. All of a sudden I'm gaining weight, or there's all these things are happening. My libido is low. And then I start asking these other questions. And there's always this moment of like, well, wait a second, how is that related to this? And as we start diving in deeper and we start educating her on that connection, you start to realize no one's ever asked her these questions before. And so, of course, she's not asking herself these questions on how it's all interconnected.
Do you get or let me just ask more openly, what's the response of women when you start to ask these kinds of questions? Are they surprised? And
A lot of tears.
yeah.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. You sit with someone and just invite them to tell their story.
Yeah.
Even if it's just tell me why you're here today.
Yeah.
Sometimes even that, like to have someone just flat out listen. So
Yeah.
many women have never had that experience.
Yeah. Well, I really think that's the role of the practitioner, is just to create space. I mean, the healer's already sitting in front of us, and I feel like that's just my role, is to bring that out in her, educate her enough to be able to discern and make decisions for herself eventually. I'm just the guide that's there and creating the safe space for her to finally express. Because there often aren't moments in her life where she can do that. And, you know, when there's things going on in our world, we want to show up a certain way for our kids, or there's things going on and we want to show up a certain way for our colleagues, or whatever it might be. We tend to mask and suppress and push aside a lot of what we're experiencing and feeling. And depending on, you know, if we are that overachiever, we may not even notice that we're feeling these things. Or if we're someone that's used to being silent, we're just suppressing and not expressing. And so when you give her that space to finally be like, how are you? You know, what's going on with you? It's like, oh, like I've never been here before and it's foreign.
Yeah, you're like, I don't know if I want to wade into that, but it is a liberating question when you're in a space that's safe where you are with a provider who can kind of listen as you're,
Yeah.
as you're answering that question.
Absolutely. It's
Well,
powerful.
I definitely want to circle back around to this because I think the most important thing is how do we incorporate this into our standard of care with women. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit more about what happens physiologically when women are under chronic stress. Because, of course, chronic stress feels bad for a lot of people, although I've been shocked where there are times where I've seen like hypothalamic amenorrhea is a classic example where women lose their cycle. If you look in a conventional textbook, the leading cause of this is high stress, right? And I've had so many women where I've treated that and they're like, I'm not really that stressed. But then you measure their cortisol and it's crazy, but really they never perceived it that way. So I think that's an important thing to know. Perceived stress is stress. Real
Yeah.
stress is stress. Biological stress is stress. But we see that it causes all these changes downstream from a hormone signaling perspective, from a receptor level at the cells. Can
Yeah.
you walk us through what actually is happening hormonally
Yeah.
when a woman's under chronic stress?
Yeah, well, the body's so intelligent. And like we were talking about before, the hormones are responding to the environment. So if the environment is one of chronic stress, whether she's aware of it or not, her brain is perceiving it as stress. And our brain is wired to be a predictor. So if there's been a pattern of chronic stress in her life, then it knows exactly what hormones to activate. So your hypothalamus, well, first your amygdala will speak to your hypothalamus and be like, okay, here it comes. That maybe there's that anticipatory stress or whatever it might be, or in an environment that maybe feels similar to where we experience a trauma, whatever that trigger might be. Immediately, amygdala is talking to your hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is telling your pituitary gland to then talk to your adrenals so that we can secrete cortisol. Initially, we're going to be secreting adrenaline if it's that acute stress because the heart rate goes up, our muscles are getting ready, we're like hyper focused to manage what's in front of us. It's when we get stuck in that state, because that in that moment might be okay, we need to run away from something, there's an acute stress, and then the body comes down from that. But that same feeling might come in traffic or when the kids have like a gazillion sports and you're managing their schedules, or maybe there's something unexpressed in your relationship that you haven't talked about. All those moments, your brain perceives it as that similar stress. So then we get stuck in this cycle of secreting more and more cortisol. And when we're in that state of survival, what the brain is telling the other part of us, like our HPO axis, is like, okay, we need to quiet down here because she needs to survive. So we got to pump her with this hormone to help her. And cortisol, one of the precursors to cortisol is progesterone. So if we're constantly pouring into cortisol, we now have lower levels of production in progesterone, which may equal insomnia, which may equal anxiety, more of that anticipatory anxiety. So now we're stuck in that loop of stress, more cortisol, and not really having enough of those hormones to ovulate or enough of those hormones to regulate our cycle or feel good in our bodies and thrive.
Yeah, there's so many interesting mechanisms with the cortisol and progesterone relationship. I want to dive a little bit more into that. And I think there's an area, this is an area of confusion for people that we get very passionate about at Dutch, because it's not the same pregnenolone that becomes progesterone and becomes cortisol. It depends which cell it's in, whether it's in an adrenal cell or an ovarian cell. But there's absolutely a connection there with stress and the reduction that we see in progesterone, which of course is one of the first changes that we see in menstrual cycle dysfunction. Um, it seems like you end up, well, we also see this ovarian health impact. Did you see the study last October that came out and they looked at the network of sympathetic nerves that arose in the ovary? We'll put that in the show notes for people again.
Actually don't remember the details, so I'd love to hear that from you. But I just remember hearing that going, aha, this validates everything that I've been thinking for years.
Yes. So this is an area of like super interest for me, this whole stress hormone connection, because I do fertility work. I have for so long, and you see the impact of stress on fertility. And of course, the fertility process is stressful. So it's like this cat chasing its tail. So I've always been diving into like what's the connection here. So we do know that the changes happen. You've talked about the signaling, the changes between in the brain, the hypothalamus and pituitary. You also have these downstream signals at the cellular level. So essentially, when there's a lot of stress hormones around, the receptors on the cells in the ovary and everywhere else in the body change. They change like based on their environment, like you said. So it impacts how cells function. But then this third mechanism just came to light, and I'll put the link in. I've talked about this a couple times on the podcast, but I find it so fascinating. But they did a study in mice, and then they did human cells. But what they found was that when women were in menopause later on in life, they had developed this entire neural network, like complete neurogenesis of a whole nervous system inside the ovarian tissue that was not there at birth. And they are sympathetic nerves. So it's very interesting because essentially throughout the lifespan, the ovary becomes more and more sensitive to stress through this direct communication through the sympathetic nervous system. So anyway, it's fascinating that there's, this multimodal mechanism for stress to impact female hormonal health and ovarian health. And I think it's important for women thinking about longevity too, because of course, the longer your ovary makes hormones, the longer, you're going to be in a better state with bone health and cardiovascular health and brain health. So it has all these implications downstream, but it just goes to show you just how critical that stress is for female functioning and how sensitive the reproductive system is.
Yeah. One thing I found really fascinating when I was doing research for my book was the part of the brain, the anterior cingulate gyrus. I don't know if you've read much about that connection between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex and how hormones can actually change the functionality in there. And its function is to create more connection between basically our emotions and how we respond to them. And it also kind of creates anticipatory anxiety in a woman's brain. And that whole center is much larger than in women than it is in men. And
Mm.
so we're almost like, I have this section called wired to worry. It's like we are wired to worry and to like read cues and signals in our environment so that we can anticipate stress or challenge and then navigate that accordingly. And so as we're aging, that starts to change, and stress will actually change its ability to communicate between the two. And so our reactions, or when women are called too emotional or whatever it might be, like there's actual physiology that makes us that way. And then when you put on the burden of not having enough hormones, especially during perimenopause and menopause, and we have that dissolving of that, the armor that those hormones are protecting in our brain, it just like it exacerbates everything that we're feeling on that emotional and physical level.
I love the way that you word that. And it's really interesting, wired to worry. You wish we could be wired to like when we're under stress, we join the do not care club, but it doesn't work out that way, does it? It's the opposite. So I one of the things I think about is like especially as a clinician when you're sitting with a patient, emotional patterns of stress are just not always obvious. And I think I'd love you to talk about that piece first, really, because a lot of women have deep capacity. And it's a beautiful thing to have that kind of capacity. But sometimes we're just holding more than really we were made to. So, are there times where you see or subtler signs or you see like physiological changes on labs even before women start to report a feeling of overwhelm themselves?
Yeah, I think a big part of it is like reading the woman in front of you and seeing even like body language, how
Mm.
she's answering her questions, eye contact. Like there's so many like body cues that we get in that present moment when you're really present with them to understand, okay, there's something that she might not be expressing right now. An example is I had a couple come to me several years ago who were basically told they could never get pregnant on their own naturally. And we're doing a lot of work with a clinic in Germany, and they were about to go to New York, and like they were doing all the testing they could. And I remember meeting her on their first day, and just how small she made herself in that room. I could tell that there was some unexpressed emotion. There's something unexpressed that she hasn't felt safe to share. And it wasn't something that I was going to go into right away because
Mm.
not everyone can open up instantly or feel safe instantly. I knew I needed to create trust with her. And it really wasn't until 6 months later where I finally started asking questions around her childhood and if there was any childhood trauma there around abuse. And she started opening up about that. And, they're on baby number 2 now, which is amazing. So I'm not saying that that one thing kind of changed everything for her because we were doing a lot of other work, detox and a bunch of different things. But what it did, it gave her room to look back and assess her patterns, look back to see when she's saying yes, when she actually means no. Look back to see when
Mm.
she's not expressing what she needs and then feeling resentful and then carrying resentment in her body because of it. Like, she had an autoimmune condition, she had cysts on her ovaries, like, there was so much going on, her body was just holding on to so much that this just allowed her to start to change and recognize a pattern within her. So as a practitioner, I think when we're sitting with someone, if we can kinda recognize these, like, subtle cues that are showing up physically and then looking at even their like, the Dutch test, I think, is, like, wonderful for that. Because sometimes a woman can tell me, "I'm not stressed." And I'm like, "Well, why is your cortisol behaving this
You're
I'm
like,
fine.
something's in you.
Nothing's
Uh-huh.
stressing me out." And
Yeah.
so then you can tell them the story through the test. And that is the part that I love because as soon as I'm relaying, like sometimes I'm not even going into their story before we do the Dutch
Mm.
test, but I'll tell them their story through the test. And there's tears instantly because they're being validated that there's something changing physiologically in their body, that their body's trying to speak to them, but they just didn't understand the language.
I want to talk more about that, but can you share an example or a story of that, of what that looked like, where you say that the Dutch test told the story and then the patient opened up?
Yeah, absolutely. So her cortisol was flatlined. Like, it just wasn't giving her the cortisol awakening response we wanted to see, and she came in thinking that I have so much energy, I'm on the go all the time, like, right when I get up, I'm good to go. I get my coffee and I'm done, and, it's no issue. And so what I started to see in that patterning was that she's not getting that cortisol awakening response, but she is getting a little bit in the evening. So she's getting that second wind in the evening. And so when I
Mm.
spoke about that, I'm like, well, this is actually telling me that you're probably operating from your reserves in a state of burnout, but you've been in this pattern for so long that you don't even know what the other side looks like. And you're able to access it because you have this pattern of whether it's overachieving or over pleasing or performing, that you don't even know what the other side looks like. And so as we started to open up, we started to see, yes, she was an athlete. She was, a student that did really well in school, and she does not even know how to slow down. And as
Mm.
soon as she does slow down, she shared with me those moments, it feels very foreign and it feels like she's doing something wrong. Then she feels guilt and then she has to step back into that same gear again. And so that was really great to just be able to have that dialogue and for her to finally admit that that's her pattern, and also for her to then see in the other symptoms that she had that this is why this was showing up. Like her immune system was talking to her. Her like irregular cycles were talking to us. So there's so much of her body language that was trying to tell us like she needs to slow down, but she just couldn't.
That's so fascinating. I think it's such a common experience that we're so accustomed to moving so fast that you don't even know what it's supposed to feel like to be inside your body. I mean, I think for women, it's like, I always think about, and I had this realization one time on vacation. It was like relaxing vacation, not a lot to do, and like 3 days into it, you're like, oh, wow, this is like, I feel really different right now, and you're like, oh, this is what it's supposed to feel like on a regular basis, except for when stress spikes. And then I'm supposed to come back here versus living at this heightened state with occasional times of relaxation. It's like we have the whole script flipped. But I think if you've ever been on vacation and had that feeling of deep relaxation, it can be a stark contrast to the way you feel on a day-to-day basis.
It's hard when you come back then. I feel like,
Oh
well, I know
yeah.
for myself, I start to grieve that version of me that was on vacation and was able to relax and was able to be soft. And, what happens then is we're communicating differently. We're communicating differently to our partners, to our children, to ourselves. And all of a sudden we can like feel an openness and this capacity to heal. And then we come back into our old environments and often get back into that same cycle. So I think there's so much deep work that needs to be done to break those cycles and break those patterns and give ourselves permission to do so, to release that identity that we've had for so long.
We'll be right back with more. The Perimenopause Management course, created by the Dutch Test, is designed to give registered Dutch providers the clarity and confidence to identify and treat perimenopause in their practice. Perimenopause can be challenging to identify, and symptoms can be difficult to correlate with hormonal shifts. Providers may also be unsure what to test for or how to treat patients who are experiencing more severe quality of life changes. This course will guide providers through perimenopause physiology and lab testing, lifestyle and supplement support, hormone therapy risks and benefits, and more. Sign up for this course in your provider portal or become a Dutch provider today to get access. Welcome back to the Dutch Podcast.
So I really want to hear your expertise around how you incorporate kind of understanding of stress and hormones in your Dutch test reading, because I think this is an area that a lot of people really struggle with on the Dutch test. And we know that there's this connection between the HPA axis and reproductive hormones. This is why these exist together in the Dutch test. Like I've not had a conversation with someone before where I feel like you really get it in the same way that you do. Can you talk us through what you're looking at on the Dutch report and how you kind of look at this to assess a woman from the perspective of how stress might be impacting her hormones?
Yeah, for sure. I think it's been so helpful to relay a woman's story to her through the testing and understanding the rhythm and the patterns between cortisol and all the other hormones that it actually impacts. And so, if a woman is clearing too much or not clearing enough, it gives me insight into her behavior throughout the day, even if she's not aware of her behavior. So when I can see that DHEA is high and cortisol is low, we know that there's that inverse relationship between the two. So we're not converting well in terms of the DHEA creating those sex hormones that she needs to feel good in her body, like estrogen and testosterone. And
Mm.
so when we see that relationship between cortisol and these other hormones, she starts to understand the relationship between stress, high cortisol, which can then turn into low cortisol, and what role that's playing in her relationship to her body, hormones, and stress. And so the other piece that I often look at too is, melatonin and how that's connected. So when I can show her her curve and show that her cortisol awakening response is stunted. She's got too much in the evening. I'll ask her, are you getting that second wind in the evening? Is it hard to get up in the morning? Or if her awakening response is super high, are you waking up already thinking about your day with your to-do list and already wired the minute you wake up?
Mm.
So it helps to really validate how she feels throughout her day when you can understand that correlation between the cortisol and her behavior. And then we can have the conversation around progesterone and the other hormones. Like we were saying, progesterone's that precursor in the adrenals to cortisol. So I've had women that have been taking progesterone for a very long time, and yet nothing's shifting in their nervous system. And so that depletion is not allowing progesterone to activate her GABA receptors in her brain to give her that calm that she needs. And so that's what I really love about adding in that ability to or look at her adrenal health and her hormones, because then she can understand the relationship between her nervous system and her hormones.
So I want to talk about a couple of specific markers on the Dutch test. So we have the cortisol awakening response, which is on the Dutch plus only, this salivary response. That I think doesn't always get the attention that it probably deserves. Can you explain what it reveals to you when you're looking at cortisol awakening response for your patients?
Yeah, for sure. There was actually a study done in Mexico a little while ago with pregnant women and measuring their cortisol awakening response and seeing the impact that actually had on the infants and their
Mm.
resilience to stress. So they took the infants at 9 months and put them in a stressful scenario, which I think is a little mean, but they do it for the studies. And they took the babies away from mom and started to see which babies were able to actually down-regulate that response in their body of stress and regulate themselves in their nervous system. So the women that didn't have an appropriate response in the morning in their cortisol awakening, like it was stunted, those women produced
Mm.
babies that couldn't basically situate themselves in that stressful environment. And so you start to see that if a woman doesn't have that cortisol awakening response, her whole day would be filled with fatigue, brain fog. All these other things are going to show up because how you wake up will also dictate how you fall asleep and the rest of your day. And so not only is it dictating her response, but if a woman is pregnant, it's also dictating the responses of her child in the future as well.
I love that you bring that up. And I've never seen that study that you're talking about, but I've seen other similar ones that show actually one of them was around depression and anxiety in pregnancy, and the offspring had the child, we say offspring in the literature, but it sounds like you're talking about animals, but talk for humans as well. What they found was that the children had a dysregulated HPA axis. And what's really interesting is that taking an SSRI medication or treating it with medication did not change the outcome. Those children also had the same dysregulation, which is such an interesting thing. And it goes into the underlying physiology of glucocorticoids and adrenaline and stress and cortisol that are not overridden by taking a medication that controls the symptoms. And I think if there's nothing more inspiring around getting ready to get pregnant or being pregnant to really focus on this, hopefully that's it. It's like it's not even just about you anymore. It's about and it is about you because you're going to have a much easier toddler if they can self-regulate in a different way compared to being at a disadvantage.
Yeah, absolutely. And some studies have even shown like preteens then have more levels of anxiety if mom had
Mm.
lower car scores. So there is a correlation because, like you said, it is going to then navigate your relationship with your child when it's an easier upbringing and their nervous system is regulated. If there's peace in the home, and if both mom and child are having challenges, there's going to be challenges. It's kind of like right now I'm going through reverse puberty and my kids are going through puberty. So there's already
It's
challenges
a
with that.
terrible alignment. It's like cruelty of nature that women hit perimenopause and kids hit puberty at the same time. It's better on the flip side of puberty. I think there's nothing better than teenagers. I really do. Like once they hit like 14, 15, and you get to see who they're going to be as adults, it's like the most amazing experience. How old are your children?
They're 11 and 14. So yes, I can
Okay,
see
yeah.
that. Hmm.
You're like just starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel with the other one, but there is this power struggle of years that are, it's really tricky. I've had three that have gone through it and then two that have not. So it's it's a wild ride, that's for sure. Yeah. So, okay, that's great with cortisol awakening response. And there's a couple other elements of the Dutch report that I know you look at that I think a lot of providers still haven't figured out how to incorporate into the assessment. I think most people look at the diurnal pattern and you really describe that. Like you can map out a patient's experience and sometimes they look at you like you're a psychic. Have you ever had that where they feel it's almost disarming because you're like, well, I can tell that you get really stressed when you come home from work, and or you're like you wake up feeling just ready to go, raring, and they look at you mind boggled that you know that. So you've talked a lot about that, but the other pieces of it are like kind of the nuances to interpreting that with things like cortisol clearance rate and the cortisol to cortisone. How do you layer that on? Because I think this is something that I always, for people who know it, I'd love to hear you explain it because so many practitioners struggle to get those concepts. So I think sometimes hearing it from the right person at the right time can be the light bulb moment.
Yeah, for sure. And I hope I explain it in a way that people do understand it because you know how you have your own interpretation in your mind.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So when I'm looking at the two curves with cortisone and cortisol. I'm understanding that cortisone is storage form. And, that is going to dictate how much free cortisol I will have in order for the body to use. So if I'm storing a lot of it, I'm not actually going to be producing enough for the body to be able to access cortisol when it's necessary and needed. And that storage, whether it's in the kidneys and, it's giving us this capacity to work through our day, to have energy throughout the day. And when we're storing too much of it, we're not getting that oomph in our day. We're not getting that zest for life because we need that hormone to give us that motivation throughout the day. And so if it's the opposite, where I'm taking so much of it and I'm not storing enough, then I know in terms of symptoms, this woman is in a more anxious state. She is constantly striving to take more and more from her stores. And so I know that's like a simplistic way of looking at those two curves, but what I find is like when I show the women that this cortisone curve should be a little bit higher and the cortisol should be a little bit lower, but have the same sort of rhythm. If they have the same
Mm.
rhythm, then they're working together because we know when we need cortisol, we have access to it. And if they're out of rhythm, that's when we know we're either producing too much or we're taking too much or we're not taking enough.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really, really well explained. And the another area of it, there are some things. I'm actually just we just were reviewing this as a team, kind of the research and what can cause things to shift in one direction or another. And sometimes it's glucose dysregulation, sometimes it's chronic stress, that you can kind of lean more towards one or the other. So it's really important to understand that because it can impact the way people feel with like how much cortisol it feels like they have in their body. And then I think the other thing that I'd love to chat briefly about is the cortisol clearance rate, which is another thing we encourage practitioners to take a look at. Do you take a look at the cortisol clearance rate?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I look at the clearance rate because that's giving me an idea of like, um, I don't know how to put it in like technical words, but like, is this woman holding on or is she able to let go?
Mm.
And if she's not able to let go, and if she's holding on too much, then we're storing too much. If she's able to let go, then we're actually creating some sort of like movement in her adrenals so that her body can adapt. So when there's
Mm.
stress, she's able to produce, use, and then clear. So looking at how quickly she's clearing is going to give me an idea of like how she's adapting to stress. And if she's not clearing enough, that's also going to give me clues as to like whether she's someone that is not expressing her stress and just holding on to it and holding on to these emotions of resentment or frustration and irritability. So then she's going to be holding more in her body.
I love that explanation, that whole like produce, use, and clear. And another just thing about that, just 'cause since we're talking about that, I'd love to share for listeners. I know that you know this already, but the cortisol clearance rate can also really affect the way you read the curve, the daily curve. So you used the example earlier of a patient with a complete flat line. And I think when we see a patient like that, we view it as an extreme example of them not making enough cortisol. And oftentimes that's the case. If the cortisol clearance rate is like in the middle of that, it's a slider bar. So it's like in the middle and they're clearing it, they're basically making it, using it, clearing it. Then that diurnal pattern of a flat line shows you they're really not making very much cortisol. So what you'd be doing therapeutically, and we can get into this next, is basically supporting them and how can we reduce stress, help them make more cortisol, and kind of respond a little bit better. Now, let's talk about a different scenario, which is if the cortisol clearance rate is very fast, which happens a lot actually, because obesity is a big driver of that. So if it's very flatlined, but they're clearing if you look at the free 24-hour versus the metabolized cortisol, they would be a complete mismatch. And so if you look just at the curve, you'd think, oh gosh, they're really not making any cortisol. I better get them to make more. But when you look at the metabolites, you actually can see that there's a ton of cortisol metabolites in the urine. And what that means for you guys that are listening is that actually they are making a ton of cortisol. They're trying to keep up, but they're burning through it so quickly, usually due to things like obesity, hyperthyroidism, chronic inflammation, things like that. They're utilizing so much cortisol at the cellular level that we're measuring that output of it. And so it's actually not a low production, it's a cellular problem. And I think that's an interesting piece is when we look at stress, what I love about the Dutch test and how we look at metabolites on top of and cortisone on top of just the free cortisol is that you can get a really broad picture of not only what's happening, because the diurnal free cortisol is almost like the last thing to change. It's like monitoring blood glucose, but not looking at fasting insulin or HOMA-IR, hemoglobin A1C, like all these things that might give you an earlier indication that there's a problem. So hope you don't mind derailing a little bit there, but I think any opportunity we have to talk about that, I love to talk about that.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important. And correct me if I'm wrong too, is it also connected when there's higher clearance to like changes in 5 alpha reductase and
Yep,
that,
absolutely can
yeah,
be.
that transformation of testosterone too. So again, someone with PMOS, for example, if she's getting that higher clearance and then there's changes in her 5 alpha reductase, we can see that there's a connection there. And then she may not even be aware that she's having these kinds of physiological changes happening in her body.
Exactly. Well, I mean, I think this is so, and I love how you're using the Dutch test. And I think using this to kind of create a conversation, really open a door and invite a conversation with women about what's happening in their lives is a really powerful use of the tool. So I'm really grateful for you explaining the impact that's had in your practice. I think it's exciting because I think the first step, of course, to manage the stress, the resentment, the past trauma is being in a space where you can talk about it and actually start to think about it and start to address it. That kind of brings me to what I want to chat about a little bit next, which is the HER method, and all the work that you're doing around actually healing the nervous system. This, to me, feels like the last black hole of integrative, functional, and naturopathic medicine. We all know we want to do it in practice, and I think it's a struggle to figure out how to implement it. Can you talk a little bit about your HER method and what you're doing with women that's really working?
Yeah, for sure. So within that method, I've created a hormonal hierarchy of healing. And so on the bottom there is physicality. So it's your physical symptoms and what we can do to understand that story. So that is often to like tracking and testing and being able to understand that on a physiological level. Because if a woman is coming to me about fatigue or insomnia, low libido, weight gain, she's not really ready to go into that emotional realm. She wants to feel better. And we can't even unravel the stories that we might be carrying if we're not feeling good or if we have brain fog. And so the first step really is to understand her from that physiological level and then supporting her with some tools that gives her glimpses of hope. Like, oh, I changed this in my diet, or I took this herb, or I took this hormone, and now all of a sudden there's just more clarity in my brain. So then the next step is the emotional piece. So now helping the woman understand, yes, you're starting to feel better. However, we may hit a plateau at some point because what your body is communicating or what the cycle it's been stuck in is still in there. So how do we unravel that? And that's where discernment comes in. That's where understanding the narrator piece that I was talking about before. That's where we can help them unravel their identities, their roles, and their conditioning, help them define what success looks like in their life, whether that's your health or your relationships. So really help them to go on this like self-discovery path. And that's where I bring in like a team of individuals that might do somatic therapy or craniosacral therapy or EMDR, whatever that individual needs to kind of help us. Again, like you, I loved what you said, is invite them into this conversation about themselves. And then we can get into the mind and actually start disrupting those patterns. And those can be something, it can be something so simple as like when we're reaching for a certain food, asking, is this going to nourish me or deplete me? And then taking that same question into everything, a conversation we're having. Is this nourishing or is this depleting? What I'm about to watch, is this nourishing or is this depleting? And so when we start to pause and ask those questions, we can make different choices. And then eventually we're starting to change the pattern and the signaling the brain is getting. So like I was saying before, it's such a predictor of our habits. So it already is giving you the hormones that you need before you even need them. Now the brain's like, oh, something's changing here. She's starting to feel a little bit safe. She's trusting herself. Maybe I don't need to give her all this cortisol. Maybe we can step back and actually start to thrive and create more of those hormones that she needs. But that comes with like understanding how we can clear the path for that communication. So in that physicality and emotional piece, there might be some detoxification that she needs or some methylation support or whatever that might be. But all of that work is clearing that cellular clutter so that their hormones can actually speak their language as they should. And then the top of the tier for me really is that soul piece and helping her look at the bigger picture of life. Like what does she want from life? What are her goals? How can she step out of this role of like mother, daughter, sister, wife, whatever roles that she's playing and just see herself as a woman and what that means for her? So I feel like if we can work on those elements with her, we're giving her hope and we're also giving her a guide and this capacity to tap into her own intuition and wisdom. So those are kind of the stages I go through, but every woman's going to require something different within those stages.
I mean, it's a really intricate and beautiful model. And I think that it's very interesting for you to be talking about really serving women. This really is naturopathic medicine at its core. Let me just summarize it like that. I mean, really getting to the point where I always think about health as living life without obstacles. And I think we generalize that to be more physical obstacles. I want to be able to bend down, pick up my grandchildren, etc. But I think like ultimately when it comes down to looking back at our lives, the things that people most regret or the things that they wish they did more of in their life, if you listen to our wise elders, they are the things that are at the top of the pyramid. You know, they're the things about finding purpose in life, you know, people, relationships, love, family, giving, whatever those things are. I just think it's so beautiful the way that you found a way to bring this into your practice. So just from start to finish, it's amazing.
Yeah, thank you. And, I often say to patients too, like we experience everything through the lens of our emotions, through like that feeling. So how we show up in our relationship, how we show up at work, how we show up for ourselves is so dictated through that emotional lens. And when we can start to identify what is important to us, I heard somebody say once, if you're on your deathbed and are there ghosts still around you about regret, like the ghosts of regret? So can you like sit with yourself and ask yourself, am I living the life that I want? Do I have the quality of relationships that I really want that are serving me and I'm serving them? So her method actually encompasses hormones, emotions, and then the last piece really is relationships. Because if we think about everything that we do is for some form of a relationship. And when we can hone in on our own um, maybe struggles or challenges within ourselves and how we see ourselves, we can start to see that we're carrying that out in those outside relationships as well. In yoga, there's a saying called ahimsa, which is nonviolence, like nonviolence towards self. Because if we have high expectations, if we're that over pleaser or that overachiever, we want that from the other person too. And when we don't receive it, that's where resentment show up. That's where anger, frustration shows up. And then when that cycle of like hormones changing, plus all of this is going on. And so when we start to recognize those patterns within, we can then start to see or release others from those expectations and be softer. Because I think women have been really stuck in this yang energy for a really long time and we've lost our softness.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, you mentioned resentment again, and that's a question that, I'd love you to talk a little bit more about that, because that's like, even just talking with friends, I think there's probably not a woman listening who can't relate to feeling resentment. And I think you've said a couple of things like it comes from saying yes when you meant to say no, or I also think about resentment as a sign that a boundary was crossed, right? Or that you need to revisit what boundaries you're setting, because it's a really important sign. Like sometimes these quote unquote negative emotions can be really important signs to you to provide direction as to what's a fit in your life and what's not a fit in your life. Is there anything else that you'd want to say about resentment? Because you brought that up, and I just think that's such a common, I would say human experience, but certainly for women that I speak with.
Oh, I think it's huge. And this is more of a clinical pattern that I've noticed that women that carry resentment often grow things in their bodies. So whether that's cysts
Mm.
or fibroids, there's often something that's like festering in their system. And if we look at it from a Chinese medicine perspective, resentment and anger kind of go hand in hand and are connected to the liver. And so when there's stagnation in the liver, we're not converting our hormones. We're not detoxing the excess estrogens from our system. So we're then growing these growths in our body. And there have been studies showing that when there's excess anger in the body, we actually increase interleukin 6, which is a pro-inflammatory cytokine. So we're creating inflammation in our body. And resentment, I think, starts at a very young age, but we don't have language around it. It's like, when mom or dad say no, and all of a sudden we have these like feelings, but we don't know what to do with those feelings. And if we're not given the space to actually express that frustration, maybe we had to hide that frustration, that's when we start to bury it. And then that becomes a pattern as we're growing up. It's like we don't want to ruffle feathers because that might mean X, Y, or Z. And so understanding that, like you said, I think there isn't a human out there that doesn't have some level of resentment. But what we can do is we can clear that out of our body. We don't have to store it. And in that storage is where the challenges start to come in.
Wonderful. This has been a fabulous podcast conversation. I'm really grateful for you spending the time. You've really have a beautiful way of describing kind of the science of human experience and really showing, I think, just how relevant it is. And I just want to, again, just acknowledge you for the way that you've brought this into your practice in such a holistic way that I think is truly making a difference in the lives of the patients you serve. So thank you for joining me today.
Oh, thank you for having me. And also, again, thank you for sharing your story. And you create a really like comforting space to actually be able to express what needs to be expressed in a conversation. So thank you.
Awesome. That's what we strive for. If people want to learn more about your work, find you, find your book, can you tell us a little bit about the best ways for them to connect with you?
Yeah, so my website's drsonyajensen.com, and that's also my handle for Instagram, Dr. Sonya Jensen. And my book you can find at healyourhormonesbook.com, and it's at all like major bookstores and Amazon as well.
Fabulous. We will make sure we put the link to that in the show notes as well. And thank you guys for joining me. I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. I think this is an area, like I said, it's kind of the last black hole when it comes to hormone balance because so many providers are struggling with figuring out how to help people with past trauma, with the emotional challenges of day to day life, and with stress. So I hope you found this as helpful and interesting as I did. If you like conversations like this and you want to learn more about hormones, spend more time with us, we release a podcast every Tuesday. So I hope you'll join me every week. You can subscribe to the Dutch podcast anywhere you're listening, and make sure you follow us at Dutch Test on all the socials. Thanks so much. See you next week.
Thanks for joining us on the Dutch podcast. Join us every Tuesday for new conversations with leading functional health experts. If you like what you've heard, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts.